Thank you so much for coming. Iryna is a professor at University of Pittsburgh, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she has published 2 novels, and you teach creative writing. So, so we read this one for our class, not your second novel, but it was an enormous success, I think, with us.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So,
what did people talk about?
So my first question was, I think you're the only writer out of this Russian Jewish American cohort to write about the Bukharin community. So if you could address this question, how you came to that.
Well, partially it was the necessity of Tolstoy's plot, ironically, because as we know that, Russians don't really view, affairs and infidelity in a very moralistic light, right? It's not a culture that's very moralistic in that regard. So to make Tolstoy's plot applicable for the present day, I needed to have a community where that was where that would be a problem in the present day, right? It's hard to transpose infidelity to the present day and make it as big of a deal as it would have been in Anna Karenina. So I needed a community like that. So luckily I'd grown up in Rego Park. So there were Bukharin Jews in the neighborhood. I just knew one woman who, when we were graduating from high school, she was already engaged. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. Of course, there were other kind of connections where a friend of the family was dating a Bukharin girl at 16, and her father said that you have to make a decision after, they were dating for a couple of months. And so I've had interactions with that. So that seemed like, okay, I could do this because that would make more sense. In a way that, setting it in a Russian community really wouldn't. So in some ways it was the limitations of transposing Tolstoy, and also in all my books I do like to learn something. I can't imagine just writing about something I know. So in each of my books I've always done research about something that I didn't know because it keeps me interested. And the Bukharin community I really didn't know much about, so I had to do a lot of research about it.
And what kind of research did you do?
Well, I did some historical research. I did some research. It's a very close community, so it's hard to penetrate. But there was a website called BukharianJews.com or something like that, and there really was an element called Ask the Rabbi. And I found it fascinating that people would be asking the rabbi all these questions about their lives, and then sometimes when it had something to do with female issues, he would just say let me send you to my wife. So I thought that was interesting because from the voices of the people asking the question, I heard the voice of people who I found so fascinating, because on one hand they're kind of like me, but on the other hand they're looking at religion as a way to make sense of their lives. They don't know that much about it, but they want to. So they're asking the rabbi all these kind of questions that I found was fascinating as a way of guidance, in a way that I felt like we didn't have that kind of, sort of religious structure that was going to somehow make sense of our lives. And so I thought that would be a nice parallel to put together sort of the amoral Russian immigrant next to the a much more traditional, a much more religious type of immigrant, and see how the two connected.
And also, my next question is, so usually I feel like all reading Russians are split into lovers of Tolstoy and lovers of Dostoevsky. And so would you consider yourself a Tolstoy lover, and that's why you primarily?
Well, I did. It was also very convenient insofar as I took, I did a PhD in Slavic, but I dropped out after the master's. It was not for me, but I did take a whole semester on Anna Karenina. So it just happened to be that I took it was a whole class. So I was able to think about this book for 4 months. We just read that book, and some of the inspiration behind that book. And so I was really able to sit with her for a long time and sit with the criticism, which made a lot of sense to me. And I think it was in reading some of the criticism that I thought, why do I find this a little familiar in a disturbing way? And that's when I was thinking oh, there are some parallels I feel like I was reading her in a whole new light through a different prism, and somehow she started reminding me of myself. So it wasn't really not so much as like I was a Tolstoy lover. I just spent 4 months with Anna Karenina, and I was getting a little creeped out about how familiar she was feeling to me. I was like, oh, this is not good. So that's how I came to that particular book. It was just I'd spent so much time with that book, and I thought so much about it. And then when I decided to leave academia in that way, that kind of academia, and decided to go for my MFA, whatever it was that I was working on, Anna Karenina and my experience of it was just percolating underneath, and that's how it made sense, it seemed like, to write about, to do something with that book specifically. But yeah, I'm sure I am probably more on the if there is a dichotomy, I'm probably more on the Tolstoy side of things.
What kind of reactions you receive from Bukharian people, whether people that you grew up with or people that you knew kind of tangentially growing up, or just other people that you heard from, what those reactions were like? I'm just interested.
Yeah, I was amazed that the Bukharian reaction, there were maybe 3 that contacted me, and they all said it felt very true to life, which I thought was very impressive. I was like, good for me. It really emboldened me to do all sorts of other crazy things after that, because I was like, hey, I could do anything, Wait a minute, I don't know anything about this. But yeah, so I did get a positive response. I did have a really lovely young woman write to me and say that this, that this was really inspirational, and that it felt very much like her life, and she was trying to move away from some of the dictates and the pressures that were, her family. She felt from her family. So yeah, for some, I have not. All the Bukharian reaction has been good, which I'm impressed by. But I don't know, maybe it's also because maybe they haven't read it. Most of the community haven't read it. I don't know. But yeah, I haven't read any other books with Bukharian characters.
No, the only big thing that I was telling you guys about was the article, but it's not fiction, the article in the New Yorker.
The Janet Malcolm book.
The Janet Malcolm book. It started as an article, and then, So that's the only other thing that really explores the community.
All of your characters seem to have really different type of thinking, but they're really realistic, and I wonder how you study your characters. Are there any protagonists, and how did you preserve this realism in the way they think? I guess this is still the stream of consciousness, right?
I don't know. I feel like not necessarily. I don't know. It's hard to think about realism from the writer's perspective. I think a lot of it has to do with empathy, a lot, of channeling, like what you think the character would be like. A lot of it is sometimes a composite of things or experienced, or, like there's a lot of aspects of Anna that are, similar to me, even though after that the big critique was that she was so unlikable, but oh well. So there's that. But I mean, what's interesting, I think, from the craft perspective is that it's not, that it's not autobiographical in the sense of your one-to-one relation to, your life. It's really about really about empathy and trying to get to the root of why people act the way they do. And so I hope that it worked. But part of the goal was to be able to convey someone's inner state of mind. So I wouldn't think that there's much stream of consciousness except maybe towards the end. And Anna's mind, very similar to a Tolstoy's, Anna's kind of feverish, increasing feverish thinking that happens especially towards the end. I wanted to recreate some of that. But the rest of the time is really trying to, explain why somebody is the way they are, or, give a little bit of background to, why people act the way they do, which I think requires empathy.
And there was one quote that you put there from Jean Seberg. Is this the way you write it? Yeah. Read to us. The quote is, "I don't know if I'm unhappy because I'm not free, or I'm not free because I'm unhappy." Can you comment on this quote?
Oh, yikes. Remember, I wrote this 9 years ago. So I'm like, did I really? I was like, what a good quote. Can't believe I came up with that. Great idea. Yeah, I can't even remember what the context is. I think it's from Lev's point of view, right? Because he's the one who likes the French films. But I mean, I think that, I think that one of the things I was playing with was the idea of, tradition versus modernity, and about where really is the freedom, like in some ways, sort of the secular Russian Jew who came here had a certain amount of, has come here for freedom, right? And sometimes, there's something, you could be somehow morally unmoored. And I wanted to compare that with Lev, who might be the other way around, where he came here, but he's still so restricted, right? Because of culture and because you're afraid to sort of push back from that culture. And, so I wondered like where the relation between freedom and happiness really is, since neither is particularly happy, but both have very different degrees of freedom.
A lot of the criticism was that Anna was so unlikable, but that's exactly the criticism of Tolstoy's novel too. I hate her, the original. I actually liked yours much more. The original drives me crazy because it makes the whole novel feel to me like a very misogynist novel, because I dislike her so intensely.
But I think most people don't remember that. I think most readers, I think that a lot of people read Anna Karenina sort of the way I did the first time, which is I think primarily a misreading of it as a romance. And I think they sort of think of her more as a victim. I think that would probably be like the general reader's takeaway from Anna Karenina, for the most part, unless they're like a careful reader. A lot of them just sort of come away feeling like, they might remember that book as being like, she was a victim of her time. She was a victim of society, right? They see her as sort of being like in the wrong place at the wrong time or something, and they don't really think about her agency in what happens in that book. So I think that might have something to do with it, is that somehow people's memories of the original has to do with her being a victim. Yeah. So they were shocked when they find someone like, wait a minute, in this day and age, there's no excuse for this kind of behavior. So just get over yourself, lady. So that was a big criticism. I think you would find that in like Amazon or wherever, where they'd be like, but she's so unlikable. I was really interested in the criticism around the book, and I remember some of the books that were, some of the critics were really influential. One was like, there was an essay called like The Framing of Anna Karenina, which was about her sort of always being somehow framed in different moments in the text, like she's in the opera box, or she's in a painting, like there's some kind of like a sense of her and the way she's represented in the text I thought was really interesting. So a lot of sort of, so some of the criticism is actually almost as influential as the book, because it really opened up the reading of her.
Did you receive any difference? Like you mentioned that the Bukharan community, the responses you got were positive, but in general, I mean, did you get any differences between the response of the general Russian-speaking community and an English-speaking community? Because, as I understand, the way Anna Karenina was understood by readers who were brought up in the Soviet Union would have been very different than it would be understood by an American reader, given the themes that were pinpointed and so forth, and given Russians are very touchy about their literature, I'd be interested how they responded.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that since 2008, the evolution of like the Russian-American writer and the Russian reader, American reader, I think has changed a lot since 2008. I think when my book originally came out, it was understood that it was for American audiences, and I think the Russian community, especially an older generation, was very dismissive of it. At least that was my sense of it. I think that's changed a lot since then. A bunch of us did an event. I think Olga was there at the JCC in Manhattan, and that was like the first time I felt like, wow, there's most of the people in the audience are Russian American. Russian Americans of all ages, and they were engaging with our work in a real serious, respectful way. There was a bunch of us, Sana, Laura, Vapyar, and a couple of other people. And but when my book came out, I did not have that experience. I think there was still that sense of like, who the hell am I? And there were still these questions of authenticity that was, that still sort of lingers, but was much more so in 2008. At that event, the best part was when somebody asked that tired question in the audience of like, but you're not really Russian, and how could you write about this? You're not even really Russian. You came when you were 7. You can't even speak the language. Who are you? And Asana actually was wonderful. I have to say, she had the best rejoinder to that person. But that's all undergone a transformation, I think. The longer people are sort of in the country, the more they're, I think, willing to engage with what we're doing. So I think that when I wrote it, I understood that it was probably going to be for an American audience, and you could see that it's written with that in mind, because it's really meant to, it explains itself in a way, of course, that it would never have to explain to a Russian audience. But I have gotten really nice response from the people who are willing to engage with it, and those who haven't just won't. So like, you can't drag people to the table. Like, what are you going to do? But as we get older and as the years go by, there's much more of an interest and there's more of an engagement, I think. While before it was pretty dismissive. And it was like, there's the real Russian writers, and then there's like some American writers, but you are neither really. And you certainly do not belong in any particular category, so this is good for the Americans, but it's not for us. So.
How would you characterize, just out of interest? I mean, every writer, like we've read more of, we read the autobiography of Gary Steininger, where of course he, directly talked about his experience as, even as a writer a bit. It's interesting when we talk to different authors and look into the little hints of their works. Just thinking about the author's own identity and how they relate with it, because it is a complex identity. How would you then, given what you just said, how do you view your Russian American identity? How do you view then the connection you have to writers as Tolstoy and the continuity, of course, that you expressed, and how would you characterize it, given that identity is so complex? It takes in language, culture, upbringing, what you yourself chose to identify as. So I'd be interested in hearing about that.
I think the only reason I was able to update Tolstoy is because of my distance from Tolstoy. I mean, that's like several distance removed. Even if I was Russian, right, as a Jew, I'm already sort of dubiously connected to Tolstoy anyway, as it is, like by default. Being an immigrant and a Jew, I'm like so far away that like it's cool. Like I can totally take that on. That's what gives me the boldness and the ability to do that, in a way that maybe I'd be more beholden, if I was closer, less removed from, but now I feel pretty removed that I could make that kind of act of transgression in a certain way. But I think what I've come to terms with about the Russian American Jewish identity is the fact that I no longer have to look at anchors of authenticity in a way that I did when I was younger, where I had to have that argument of the older Russian immigrant was saying, you're not even Russian, you left when you were 7, you don't even really speak Russian. I thought that would be an obstacle at one point. And I think a lot of immigrant writers actually have this struggle. I did a panel of all different immigrant writers from different cultures, and a lot of people had that question in the audience. These are all writers who are trying to write about their identities, and they said, well, I immigrated from Cuba when I was 3. How could I write about that? What right do I have to that story? And so a lot of the things that we were talking about was the fact that, taking that right to that, to that identity being not as belonging to one or the other experience, but as being a much more complex mashup in a certain way of the various different, so there's the Jewish tradition, the American tradition, and the Russian tradition. So I no longer have to go to Russia and say, am I Russian or not Russian? It's sort of like I don't need that approval anymore, in a way that I thought I did. I sort of have passed that. And yes, I've thrown my lot in with English. Yes, I could probably be a more fluent Russian speaker. That's okay. Those were the decisions that I made in a certain way. And, so I'm just, at this point that I'm owning those decisions that I made, where I'm on the spectrum of Russianness, where I'm the spectrum of Jewishness, where am I in the spectrum of, all, American writers and those influences. I think that often when people talk about immigrant writers, they always make that simplistic lineage from their country of birth, when of course none of us, all of us could say, whether it's me or Gary, or we could all say that our influences are quite wide, from Kundera to Philip Roth to, to Emily Bronte, exactly, to Achebe, to whoever. And so our literary predecessors are maybe, only slightly more Tolstoy than it would be Philip Roth or whoever, anybody else, with regards to voice. So in some ways understanding that it's not just about like where you're born, where your literary identity and your personal identity is really an amalgam of different choices and circumstances in life, and there's no reason to make a choice, and and I don't have to prove anything to anyone because those are the choices that I made. Of course I can go back to Russia and do all that, and some people have made that choice. I didn't, and that's okay. That's a very long-winded answer. I don't know if
we touched a little bit about what your sort of research process was for writing this book, but also I was interested about your writing process. If you have one particular process every time that you're writing something, or whether it changes depending on the nature of what you're writing.
Yeah.
Between books, I don't know.
Every book has its own process. Every book needs different things. I'm writing book number 4. I've turned in the 3rd book already to the publisher. And now I'm on the 4th book, and every single book is different and required different things. And so it's been completely wildly different. So every book needs its own process.
What's the 3rd book?
The 3rd book is coming out in 2019, and it's and that's a much more simple story than my 2nd book. It's actually about Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine. I was interested in that. So it takes place during 2014, 2016, and it's a Ukrainian immigrant who's in her 50s or like late 40s, 50, and it's a very simple story of her just trying to get her daughter out of the region, and she has all these different complex, there's immigration challenges, there's a complicated relationship with their daughter, so it's a very simple story of a mother trying to get her daughter out of a war zone in Ukraine. And so I did a lot of research on the conflict, and so again, this is a character. She's not Jewish, she's Ukrainian. It's a little foreign to me. I hope, I'm a little nervous about it because of course I wrote that all before now. So the political, landscape has gotten much more complicated even than when I wrote it, but that's what the next book is about. Oh, the 4th book I can't talk about because it's still in progress, but that has a male protagonist, so that'll be a nice change.
That's great. So when we were reading Steingart's memoir, he writes about you and says that you guys went to the same school.
Mm-hmm.
That is a crazy coincidence. It seems that 2 of the more famous writers from this cohort knew each other as kids.
Yeah. Yeah, it is strange, but I guess we were both equally, traumatized, which I guess, trauma really feeds good literature, I suppose. Being the outsiders. There were only 3 of us actually, who were Russian speakers in that whole class, and the 3rd one is my best friend, and she's the person who sort of the 2nd book is modeled on because she was the head of Russian art at Sotheby. So it's kind of funny that the 3 of us just had. It was just us 3. They were the only Russian speakers in that class. But yeah, the fact that we were both in the same class is funny.
That's interesting. Yeah. Have the novels been translated into Russian? They have not.
Nope. Somebody has to do it. It's not going to be me. So it needs to be somebody, some Russian, some native Russian speaker. Who's really able to do it. I mean, a few people have mentioned it, but no one has actually done it as far as I know.
Yeah, but
and I'm not sure Russians, I don't know if they'd want to read it. Maybe they would, but maybe not, I don't know. Maybe there's not enough of an interest because it's really an American story. I don't know.
I wanted actually to come back to the question about identity and unpack it a little bit. You said that you can belong to 3 identities, right? But some of them are conflicting, and your characters also have this choice between identities where they can kind of free themselves from overthinking. And I would just ask you how you see their mental work, how they perceive their reality. And do you see literature as some kind of psychoanalysis for the reader?
As far as the different identities. I think that, especially in the second book, this comes out more overtly, where I have a sense that, that with identity, it's like clothes, where it's something you put in front of whoever you need to put in front of, right? So it's really a sense of being able to swap out different outfits, depending on who the listener is. And I think that, women are particularly good at this because it's just, they're very used to being sensitive to external judgment. So I think that in a certain way, when I have characters battling like, am I Jewish, am I Russian? This happens a lot in the second book, is that a lot of it has to do with personas and conflicting personas. So it's like, me and Gary, I think we both wrote about that, about like we would go to our Jewish school and there would be this one set of persona you had to put on with the rabbis, and then you'd go home, and then you would, when you're at home, it's completely conflicting, right? Because your parents are saying, here, have a ham sandwich, and you were just at like a conservative day school all day. So you're like, okay, well, with my parents, I'm going to have ribs, but at school, I'm a kosher Jew, like, what the hell? So I think that we early on understood that, like, we needed to put forth the right persona depending on what location you're in. And this is an immigrant issue. This is I think a lot of immigrants share this, external, the public versus private personas, where, they're in private, they're one persona, in public, they're another persona. So all these different identities are just something you can juggle and shift at will. And as far as literature being psychoanalysis, I think that it's, I think hopefully it's primarily about empathy. I really think that it's about us understanding other people that are different than us, or seeing something in the characters that are similar to us, like I did with Anna Karenina, that could be really useful. And it's, I think that it's about making links with self and other. And if that results in any psychoanalytic, benefits, then that's great. I don't know if it does for everybody, but it's, I think it's certainly, the goal is certainly to be making links in our minds. I think that we're always there to make comparisons, like how this person is different than me, or this person is similar to me, and you're always placing the characters along some kind of spectrum with yourself, I think when you're reading. And I think that's the benefit of literature. Just like the benefit of certain genres is to think about the present day. Like the reason why we read science fiction is to think about contemporary moment, or historical fiction. The benefit is we're thinking about, like, have we come a long way since 1850 or whatever. So the idea is that there's like an invisible rope that links the reader's self to the characters, and you're always thinking about where you are in relation to them, and how overt that is depends on the reader and the book. That sometimes the writer makes those things more overt, and sometimes they leave it more up to the reader's imagination.
One thing that differs greatly from Anna Karenina, right? The fact that there is that in your novel, Lev and Anna, it's possible that they really should have been together, but in the original, that was not.
Right.
That's not there.
Yeah.
He's quite happy with Kitty.
Yeah. He does go and see her, and he thinks like, "Ooh, she's kind of cute," I think. Right? There is one scene, but he's like, "But not for me."
He feels pity for her.
Yeah. He's too good.
Anna Karenina, yeah, he's too good. Yeah. Because that's like Tolstoy and his post-womanizing phase.
But it was interesting because Lev and Katya also weren't perfect together. Like I kept expecting them to be like this totally idealistic match, and they were better off than a lot of other couplings, but it wasn't so clear cut, which I also thought was very interesting to rework that and complexify the relationships. Because I think Tolstoy had this way of sort of making a person like a tokenized, like they represent this type of person and that, and he made them more human, because he used them as vehicles for his ideals. So, yeah.
Yeah. He's interesting insofar that they do, he can't help it. Sort of he creeps that in, but there are moments where the characters do conflicting things, which is what makes him so good. And I think there is a little bit of that in the original book where the marriage isn't that great, actually, at first.
But like I think once they start, like
right, when the children come, then all is well. Like, of course,
Yeah.
that's sort of when he, that's the saves the day. Certainly for Kitty, who's now finds, in motherhood, all her questions, all her questions are answered.
He finds it in the land. She
Yeah,
finds it in the kids.
Yeah.
God, a 19th century cliche. I actually love like the Karenina on the Karenina. At the beginning, he's so amazing when like he's so in love with the child. Of course, then he becomes like completely horrible. But there is this moment where he's such a wonderful, like pure human being.
Yeah. He's not bad. You kind of like him the best
Yeah,
out
you
of
really
all at the
like
end
him
of the
a
day.
lot. Yeah.
But yeah,
Actually,
sympathetic
I like
is a big
Vronsky
issue.
a lot too.
Yeah,
Because at first,
you
when
kinda feel
Vronsky
bad.
first appears on the Karenina, he, it's like, oh, he's so shallow. He seems so shallow and so like this handsome guy. But he has so much depth towards the end of the novel. There's so many things he wants to do. He wants to paint. He wants to, go into politics. I think I love Vronsky. Just good talk about Vronsky. I had some more questions for you. So one thing that I think is so amazing, obviously, about literature, but also about this novel is you had Donald Trump in here. Hello?
Did I?
Yes, you did.
Oh God, I don't remember.
So one of the guys that Anna is dating, whoever she's talking about, like these Russian guys that she's dated, and she talks about how, they have, one of them had a copy of like Donald Trump's
Really?
Guide to Success.
Oh my God, that's
so you
that's
predicted
right.
the future.
Yikes, that's scary to think that's how prevalent he was even back then.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Right, that's right, Donald Trump, that's right. Yeah, but because, right, that's what those, the cliche of the Russian guy would have, of course, seen Trump as a big model.
Yeah. But I think it's so great how art predicts life,
Good God.
Yeah.
That's scary. But yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense, doesn't it? Now that
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah. So to maybe broaden that question is, what is your relationship to Russia and to things Russian, and what do you think, if you think anything of the impact that Russia has had on?
Yeah,
the
I mean, it's
election
all
last year.
it's all a little depressing, but it's interesting. I can never have predicted that Russia would play such a big role, because I think in one hand we do so much to sort of deny its power. So I was kind of surprised to see that, like, it was admitted, how, that it was somehow it's come out much more in a way that I think before it wouldn't, people want to hear underplay Russia's, potential power. So it was interesting to see how that played a role. But, I mean, as far as the place, I went back last time, it was 2009. I would like to go back. That was fun.
How many times have you gone? This was the first time, or so just once you've gone back? And for how long were you there?
That was just a week.
And you're in Moscow?
Yeah, and that was interesting because I was supposedly go with my parents, and we were supposed to, visit all the old haunts, but then I also got an assignment for a magazine. So my parents stayed in some chalupa, like in the outskirts, and I stayed at the Ritz. Right? I felt really guilty. It was supposed to be this vacation with the parents, and they're using, sheets for toilet paper, and I have like warmed bathroom floors, So I got to sort of saw the high and the low, you got to really see the two extremes on that trip, where you saw like the super wealth and that the real normal people life, and the combination was crazy. The two extremes were insane. So I felt a little bit bad for my parents that they had to continue on this vacation while I was sort of living the high life. over there. But so that was an interesting experience. It was an unusual kind of welcome back trip, and I would go back. I'd like to. Just haven't had a chance to do that yet, but I would love to go back. But you do get a little bit spoiled once you once you've had that. Yeah, once you've been there, it's sort of like it's not an easy place. It's not an easy place. It's my parents were very traumatized. I don't think they're ever going to go back. They've gotten way too used to the American way of life. They forgot that like you have to barter for everything, and you always yelled at all the time. And they're like, they forgot what that was like. They've gotten all soft,
like
not being yelled at.
Nice.
Remember there was a movie a few years ago. There was a new adaptation of Anna Karenina.
With Keira Knightley.
Yeah.
Or Jude Law's Karenina.
All Russians were, whoever I know, they were like terrified.
How could they touch something so sacred?
Because there's a sense of ownership, cultural ownership, which in some ways it feels like, no, I know it best. Like, clearly I know it. This is a text I know better than anybody else. There's always going to be somebody when you do something like this that is going to say, like, what in the world are you doing and why? But I don't know. I think that it's a little bit different insofar as that was an adaptation of Anna Karenina. It wasn't even like it was trying to be inauthentic, right? So it was trying to capture it.
This enormous book happened,
right? Which is a little bit different than sort of using it as a jumping off point for something completely different. I mean, I don't think I like that movie that much either, but I kind of. But it just wasn't that good of a movie, period. But yeah, I mean.
But I felt like this was like it felt like it was inspired by the book rather than attempting to be it.
Right, exactly. That's very important because. But still, that's why I find that the criticism about whether it's dismissive or using it as sort of misses the point in a certain way, because it's about thinking about this new thing, I've made that link for you, and your job is to think about the new thing, and with that as a sort of jumping off point. It's not about to go back to that old thing and say, is this thing?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's very stale criticism because people for hundreds, thousands of years have been using old material and
right.
updating it and making their own genius works of art from it.
Right.
I mean, if you think about anything throughout history of art and literature, it's someone has done it before. So what? Can always make it better.
Or updating.
Or
and there's no
update or
original
do your
plot.
own thing.
There's no original plot.
There's no original plot.